Hey, good afternoon, everyone. We just wanted to wait a couple of minutes to get some people in the room while we wait. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in and joining us today for our February Practitioner of the Month webinar with my very good friend, Brendan Vermiere. Brendan's a clinical educator and functional medicine practitioner with a background in fitness and nutrition. He is also the creator of the Functional Mental Health Certificate Program, the Mental Map Lab Test, and Neuroceuticals supplement line. Brendan has one heck of a journey, and I really appreciate that he shares it with the world, and he's here to share and educate us on a number of areas with mental and metabolic illness. So Brendan, if you want to take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Bobby. I really appreciate you. And it's good to have an excuse to hang out with you and my friends at MaxGen. So thank you for having me. Let me go ahead and get my screen share going. I think I managed to turn off all those notifications. All right. So thank you all so much for tuning in, those of you that are here live, and for those of you watching the recording in the future. So we have quite a bit of information that I want to try to cover in about 60 minutes, about 63 slides. I know that we can do it, so we'll go ahead and get started, but thank you all so much for your attendance and your time and attention. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the missing links in mental and metabolic illness, which I would consider to be methylation, nitric oxide, and the microbiome. So this is a newer lecture that I've been cooking up in recent months and really love this content. I hope you do too. All right. So for those of you that don't know who I am or not familiar with my work, this is just an overview of my eclectic career. I do a lot of work in the functional medicine space. As Bobby mentioned, I have, my own businesses and programs and testing and all that cool stuff. And then I do a lot of scientific advising for other companies. So I'm excited to be doing some work with MaxGen Labs and advancing genetic research and everything. This is my official bio if you want to learn a little bit more about me. But I want to go ahead and dive into the presentation here. So some of the objectives that hopefully we accomplish here, I want to teach you all a little bit about some important concepts such as microglial activation, methylation, nitric oxide, and nitric oxide synthase uncoupling or NOS uncoupling, the nitrate pathway, which I'm finding most practitioners don't really know anything about, and the role of the oral and gut microbiome in modulating some of these pathways. I want to help you increase the depth of your knowledge on specific mechanisms. I'm a very mechanistic-minded individual, by which methylation disturbances, nitric oxide dysregulation, and microbiome dysbiosis can perpetuate one another. And of course, I want to make sure we're not just talking about abstract or theoretical, mechanistic science, but also how do we employ this clinically? How do we apply it clinically, right? So what testing, what clinical tools, what biomarkers can we use to objectively qualify some of these dysfunctions? And then of course, how can we therapeutically help our patients and clients feel better faster, right? So I do want to invite you all to submit questions and comments into the chat box. We won't have time for a Q&A today, but we might do a live Q&A on Instagram if we want. So feel free to drop all the questions and comments that come up. All right, so to go ahead and kick us off on the right foot here, this is my career statement. This is my working theory, and I will likely spend the rest of my career and life validating this statement. So I would argue that mental illness is largely an epigenetic phenomenon driven by oxidative stress, inflammation, and neuroendocrine dysregulation. I am very strategic with my verbiage. I say largely, not exclusively, right? And certainly you don't have to take my word for it. There is a massive body of literature that already really proves and validates this. It's just not very common knowledge. So for those of you that don't really know anything about me, I have actually a very tragic sob story. That's another story for another day. I actually just posted about it on Instagram on Monday because it happened to be my 10-year anniversary from a suicide attempt in 2014. So I woke up in the intensive care unit after being in a coma for like 3 days. And long story short, I experienced firsthand just how dysfunctional the conventional psychiatric model really is. And it was such a powerful and disturbing experience for me that I've really dedicated my life and career to doing something about it. So this is me in 2021, 7 years after almost killing myself, giving a CME lecture to hundreds of psychiatrists at IMMH to teach them a more functional approach. So that's kind of my glow up story. And certainly I go into more depth in other things. So I want to just quickly run through the mental health pandemic. I think anybody that's tuning into this presentation, I'm sure we can all appreciate the mental health crisis and how it's really the worst it's ever been. And unfortunately, the trajectory is not looking good. Things are going to get worse before they get better. And it's going to take all of us in the functional medicine space working together to make any bit of difference. And it's a massive undertaking. So certainly this is what gets me out of bed in the morning. And of course, when you look at chronic disease statistics and mental illness statistics, we see suicide is a leading cause of death for young people. It was actually the 10th leading cause of death for Americans before COVID. And we actually saw a decrease in suicide rates during COVID, but a large increase in neuropsychiatric drug prescription fills, right? And so you can certainly look at the slides to check out some of these, specific statistics. We see that young men are actually the largest, most rapidly growing demographic of psychiatric drug consumers, which I contributed to that statistic. I used to be medicated on multiple things, and today I'm medication free. I have been medication free for many years now. So part of my story. And then these are heat maps showing suicide rates in the United States, 2008 to 2014. Over here, they're more looking at the diabetes belt of America and looking at neuropsychiatric drug use. So something I want to highlight here, obviously, there's a lot of overlap between these heat maps, but this region, the southeastern region of the United States, it's often referred to as the diabetes belt because there's more diabetes and metabolic syndrome there than anywhere else in the country. And obviously, the United States is by far the most metabolically ill population on earth. What went wrong, right? We could talk about that for hours. But I just want to postulate this of, do we think that maybe there's a connection between metabolic illness and mental illness, right? Pretty much no matter how you look at the data all really shows that. So for example, suicide rates on the left side, obesity rates on the right side, positive correlation. Now, of course, correlation doesn't equal causation, but certainly with mental health, there's a huge conversation to be had around, there's the psycho-emotional aspect of mental illness and then the physiological. And I actually have a brain yin yang logo that many of you maybe have seen on Instagram. And that's essentially what that brain yin yang is supposed to illustrate, is the psychological side and the physiological, and how these really get mixed together in a very kind of complex way. It can be really hard to work with individuals, clients, patients struggling with mental illness, because you really have to delineate between the psychological healing opportunities and the physiological. And this is where I find lab testing to be extremely valuable, because it brings objectivity to what is otherwise a very subjective and nebulous journey, right? So this is a powerful statement that you can read, but essentially it's saying how, we have this massive conventional healthcare system that dispenses neuropsychiatric drugs like Halloween candy. I being one of those. When I was first put on a neuropsychiatric drug, I was 17. It was my senior year of high school. I was just doing a physical for athletic participation for wrestling season coming up. And I just kind of mentioned, some depressive symptoms, no blood work, no lab testing, no neuropsychiatric evaluation, no referral, just primary care physician of like, hey, 17-year-old kid trying to figure out life. Here's a prescription for Zoloft, which ended up making me feel worse, like an apathetic anhedonic zombie, right? So this is a chart from a Medicare beneficiary report from 2010, 14 years old at this point. And I just want to highlight how the Medicare beneficiaries that were in this data analysis, the ones that were diagnosed with depression, only about 10% had only depression. Whereas if you look at the purple bar over here, this is illustrating how about 40% of these Medicare beneficiaries with depression had 5+ other chronic conditions, right? So there's a huge conversation to be had about the comorbidity of mental illness. It's pretty rare for somebody to really only have a mental health diagnosis, but not have any other type of, chronic disease diagnosis. And there's two components to that. Of course, if you are living with one or multiple chronic conditions, obviously that is going to have this psychological burden that might contribute to neuroendocrine dysregulation or depression or stress or whatever. But there's the physiological psychosomatic tie-in also of how their physiology is really disturbed that then is driving neuropsychiatric symptoms, right? So this is what makes mental health a little bit challenging to work with at times. So we see that millions of people worldwide are struggling with depression. It's projected to become the second leading cause of worldwide disease and disability by 2030, which is only 6 years from now. We see Alzheimer's is affecting at least 36 million people worldwide. It's usually more than the literature cites, and this number is predicted to triple by 2050, right? So again, things are looking like they're going to get worse before they get better. Now, with mental illness or neurodevelopmental disorders or neurodegenerative conditions, for decades now, we've really been sold this narrative that mental illness is the result of brain chemical imbalances. We don't know why it happens. There's a genetic component. It's heterogeneous in its sort of origins, but there's not really anything you can do about it other than take this drug that's going to balance your brain chemicals, and maybe you should talk to somebody. That's about it, right? And that narrative is really a marketing narrative from pharma, right? We can all appreciate that. And that narrative is really based on the monoamine theory of mental illness. And at this point in time, the monoamine theory, it's not incorrect, but it is outdated, right? So the monoamine theory was focusing on the role of neurotransmitter signaling in driving neuropsychiatric symptoms, right? But these days, the more modern leading theories of mental illness and neurodevelopmental disorders and neurodegenerative is really more focused on the cytokine theory, which is looking at the role of pro and anti or pleiotropic cytokines and chemokines and how that can drive a lot of symptoms, as well as the neurotrophic theory, which is more so focused on neurotrophic factors such as brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And these neurotrophins are proteins that really regulate neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, which is how we birth new neurons and then integrate those neurons into existing neural networks and rewire, or through synaptic trimming and pruning, we can modulate our neural connections as we learn new skills or have, memory formation or unlearn self-limiting belief systems, right? In order to unlearn self-limiting beliefs, we have to rewire our neural networks, which takes a lot of synaptic trimming and pruning and neuroplasticity so we can change the wiring, the circuitry of our brain, right? Makes a lot of sense. And I think the science is very empowering to help people struggling with their mental health understand, actually, my body is very resilient. It's very adaptable. It's very plastic. I can rewrite the story of my life by rewiring my brain. So that's an empowering sort of narrative that is very much evidence-based based on the technical science. So this is where I coined the phrase microglial activation syndrome. So this is, I guess you could call it a pseudo-diagnosis or a functional diagnosis, whatever. But it's a paradigm and it's really a working theory. So all of my work, my whole career, really, and if I have a claim to fame, this is it, is coining the microglial activation syndrome concept. So essentially what this is all about is looking at these microglial cells, which only make up about 15% of the cell population in the central nervous system. But these microglia are the innate white blood cell of the central nervous system. I like to refer to them as the architects and guardians of your central nervous system. If we're talking about neurodevelopment, it's really the microglia that are facilitating the development of our neural networks. If we're talking about neurodegeneration and the excess breakdown and degeneration of our brain and neural networks, it's really the microglia that are facilitating that breakdown. Or if we're trying to protect our brain from COVID, guess what? It's the microglia that save the day. So the activity and activation status and morphology of these glial cells arguably is the number one thing that we should care about if we're trying to return to homeostasis in the central nervous system. It's literally impossible to be up to date on the literature with anything mental health related without running into this very profound subject of glial activation and morphology. It's the immune system of the brain. It's there to protect the brain and to maintain homeostasis. So we can look at many root cause factors. This is just a succinct summarized list here, but we can look at many root cause factors that can disturb the activation status and the morphology of these microglial cells. It could be something more metabolic in nature, such as hyperglycemia and advanced glycation end products and insulin resistance. It could be something like anemia and hypoxia. It could be something like a, stealth infection or dysbiotic issue. It could be more neuroendocrine, like excess cortisol and immune cell priming. It could be toxic load induced, nutritional status influenced, trauma and social isolation. There's so many environmental, lifestyle, and psychological factors that are going to modulate the activity of these glial cells, right? And so a lot of times I feel like in the functional medicine space, when people are getting a little bit carried away with things like mast cell activation or this activation, a lot of times it's like the cells are being blamed for behaving in a dysfunctional way. And I don't agree with that logic. No, the cells are behaving exactly as they are programmed to through evolution. They are simply responding to the milieu or the environment that they're marinating in. So instead of blaming the cells for being dysfunctional or using synthetic drugs to try to change the activity of the cell, we need to be correcting the environment that the cells are within to return to homeostasis, right? So let's not blame the cells for being dysfunctional. Let's identify why are they behaving this way, right? So this is where neuroinflammation, neuroplasticity is really a balance of microglial activity. So with glial cells, we can polarize our microglia into a pro-inflammatory cytotoxic M1 phenotype, or we can polarize them into this anti-inflammatory neuroprotective M2 phenotype, right? In the milieu, the environment really is going to determine the morphology. So this is why I created my own lab test that's called the mental map. MAP stands for Microglial Activation Profile. Great branding, better science, very proud of this. So I created a lab panel that objectively assesses a lot of well-established, clinically studied biomarkers, so that way we can objectively qualify the degree of neuroinflammation or microglial activation or neurotransmitter dysregulation, methylation, oxidative stress, so on and so forth. So these are some of the core areas that the mental map is designed to assess objectively. So this is something that I provide a lot of training on to practitioners, teaching them how to use that test. And I do have a case study that I want to make sure we get to that I can illustrate the mental map in clinical application. So let's continue on here. So we have to recognize that 88%, according to that study that was published in 2020, early 2020, only 12% of Americans are considered metabolically healthy. The other 88% are considered metabolically ill. And out of that 12% that's not metabolically ill, how many of them are metabolically fit? My background is metabolic fitness and performance as a trainer and nutrition coach. I've been obsessed with metabolic capacity for my whole career. And that has served me very well in the functional medicine space because a lot of functional medicine doctors are catching up when it comes to metabolic science. So standard American metabolism, this is how I coin it. Uncle Sam is not really living his best life. Obviously, the obesity, the non-alcoholic fatty liver, the dysbiotic leaky gut, neuroendocrine dysregulation, HPA dysregulation, leptin resistance, insulin resistance, sluggish thyroid, methylation issues, MTHFR, all the things, right? All the things, the standard American milieu, if you will. So this is where let's go ahead and get into kind of some of the main themes of today's presentation with methylation and nitric oxide in the microbiome. So with methylation, just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is the one carbon cycle. We're just moving around these CH3 functional groups to change the structure and therefore function of various molecules. So certainly we have to appreciate that there's over 35 plus crucial biochemical pathways that are really regulated by methylation. And just to put it into perspective, this is a biochemical process that's going on billions of times per second in every cell of the body, right? And as much as I love functional medicine, we kind of overcomplicate things for clients and patients, and yet at the same time oversimplify the complex science, right? So methylation is something that we can obviously influence, but it's not like we can reach into the body and, activate this enzyme, turn off this enzyme in this very linear way. We study the pathways as these simple little, drawings and sketches, but no, this is a complex biochemical reaction going on billions of times every second in every cell of your body, right? So this is also where I don't like the terminology of over methylating or under methylating. What does that even mean? Like, which one of your 30 trillion cells is over methylating and under methylating? And it's like a light switch that's turning on, turning off billions of times a second, right? So this isn't something that we can oversimplify, but it is something that we can influence through environmental intervention, lifestyle intervention, supplemental medication, so on and so forth, even psychological, right? So we actually see with trauma, for example, traumatic events change methylation of our genes that then induces this more dysfunctional epigenetic phenotype that is a traumatized individual expressing PTSD symptoms, right? It starts at the genetic level as the genes are being turned on and turned off with methylation and acetylation, and that then alters our biochemistry, that then alters our physiology, that then presents as clinical symptomatology, right? So certainly as we move on here, we appreciate that about 1 in 3 Americans are thought to have an MTHFR polymorphism. MTHFR, let's give Ben Lynch some credit. I don't know why Gary Brecka's is all of a sudden, I know he was on Joe Rogan and whatever, but Ben Lynch was really the guy, like the guy that brought methylation, full steam to functional medicine. That's who I first studied methylation under. So this Gary Brecka's thing is kind of, I don't know, doesn't quite feel right. But either way, with MTHFR, here's the thing is the two polymorphisms that get all the press are the 677 and 1298. But according to the research, there's over 14 MTHFR SNPs that have been identified as clinically significant thus far. Now, with genetics, I love genetics, and it's the future of medicine, no doubt. But what can we do with genetic information now, right? Because yes, we can assess certain genetic polymorphisms, but we also have to assess the physiology in real time. The genetic predisposition, that's just the predisposition. The question is, what is the current state of epigenetic expression, AKA the current state of physiology and biochemistry, right? So certainly when we look at, we have what, 23 to 25,000 genes in the human genome, 100 times that in the microbiome, which largely influences us. And to date, there's over 90 million single nucleotide polymorphisms identified in the human genome. Even, the best genetic tests are only going to test for what, 200, 300, maybe 1,000 SNPs. So we really are just scratching the tip of the iceberg in regards to the depth of genetic polymorphisms and how that alters clinical outcomes, right? So some are better studied than others, the ApoE, the breast cancer gene, MTHFR, so on and so forth. And this is where I love getting to work with, thought leaders like MaxGen Laboratories to advance the research. How can we better employ these tools to educate and empower our clients and patients? And it's all about how we deliver the information. If we deliver genetic information in a fear-mongering way of like, oh my gosh, you have ApoE, you're going to die in your 60s from Alzheimer's, that's going to induce a nocebo effect. And we are doing wrong by them by doing that. As opposed to, hey, isn't it great that now we have this information because now we can empower you to make more health conscious decisions with your lifestyle so, that your genetic blueprint is not your destiny, right? So this is coaching psychology and bedside manner, right? And ethics. So either way, methylation defects have been linked to a myriad of health disorders, chronic conditions, neuropsychiatric, autoimmune, all the things, right? So you can check out that list there. Now, key functions of methylation. I go into much more depth in my methylation course, of course, but this is just a succinct overview of some of the key functions of methylation. And one of the ones I really want to highlight for today is nitric oxide production, right? We have to have healthy methylation to create biopterin or BH4, which is one of the major cofactors for nitric oxide synthase. And we'll talk about that a little bit more momentarily. But I've been working with methylation for many years. It's been a huge focal point of my work. because it's such a cool biochemical mechanism that we can modulate with so many different strategies that's going to boost many other functions in their body, whether it's their cell membrane health with phospholipids or creatine and mitochondrial function, carnitine, CoQ10, myelination. It's so, so cool. So methylation is absolutely something that we want to be assessing genetic predispositions for, assessing the current state of methylation using something like the mental map and blood work and clinical biomarkers to assess how they're methylating currently, and then obviously tracking this over the course of time. So there's a lot of different SNPs that have been linked to methylation dysfunction. Of course, MTHFR, that gets all the press, but there's so many other genes and enzymes within the methylation and transsulfuration pathways that are going to impact global methylation status. A few years ago, I was consulting for a different clinical laboratory, and we were toying with the idea of trying to develop a lab test that assessed global DNA methylation, AKA out of all of your DNA, kind of what percentage overall is methylated as sort of this more macro view of methylation status at the genetic level. We never went through with it all the way, but I thought it was a cool concept. So of course, there's a lot of things that we can do to modulate methylation. Here's a good list of just some of the factors that might interfere with or disrupt or inhibit methylation-dependent reactions. Things like free radicals, different pro and anti-inflammatory cytokines, or pathogen-associated molecular patterns like LPS, mold toxins, heavy metals, acetaldehyde, stress, nutrient deficiencies, medication use, so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that impact this. So we have to think very, very dynamically and holistically. So this is a good diagram of just the folate and methylation and transsulfuration pathway, a more simplistic version of it. Obviously, we don't have time to, walk through it step by step. I do that in other trainings here. Just take a peek at time, see how I'm pacing. Not well. Let's speed this up. So, of course, one of the key functions of methylation being very much related to neurotransmitter metabolism, of course, getting back to our monoamine theory of mental illness. So as I mentioned, the folate pathway is directly connected to the bioterin pathway, that BH4, which is that necessary cofactor that we need to produce tyrosine, serotonin, dopamine, obviously melatonin as well, and nitric oxide, which is a big one. And what we see is when immune cells, specifically I'm referring to macrophages in the periphery and then the microglia in the central nervous system, when they get activated, there's a specific enzyme, guanosine triphosphate cyclohydrolase 1 or GTPCH1, illustrated right here. And when this enzyme is activated by something like lipopolysaccharide or interferon gamma, which are the main two inducers, this will actually modulate this pathway. And the microglial cells and macrophages start producing this neoterin molecule, which is one of the core markers on the mental map. We can measure neoterin in the blood. It's one of my favorite biomarkers ever. And as neoterin goes up, bioterin availability goes down. So it's a great surrogate marker where we can directly assess macrophage and microglial activation. And we know that this pathway is being activated and therefore dysregulated. And we also know that as neoterin and homocysteine are going up and up and up in the blood, bioterin bioavailability goes down, which then compromises our ability to produce nitric oxide through the NOS pathway and also dysregulates a lot of our neurotransmitters. So this is stuff that we can, optimize and work smarter, not always harder. So one of the things that we see with methylation, homocysteine is still really largely considered the gold standard blood-based biomarker that we can use to assess for current methylation status. I like to see it between 6 and 8. Problems really start arising when you're 10 and higher. 15 to 20 is like really high for homocysteine. But homocysteine can actually stimulate NMDA receptors on the blood-brain barrier. This activates an intracellular pathway called beta-selectin, which decreases the expression of claudin-5, which is one of the tight junction proteins in your blood-brain barrier endothelial lining. Now, of course, for those of you that are familiar, we also have NMDA receptors on a lot of our brain cells. And as that homocysteine is stimulating the NMDA receptor, this drives more glutamatergic excitotoxicity and decreases GABAergic activity. What does that do? Anxiety, brain on fire. And even in more severe excitotoxic cases, it can cause brain cell damage and even death in more severe circumstances. So let's kind of shift a little bit and segue into nitric oxide. The miracle molecule won the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1998 and was proclaimed Molecule of the Year in my birth year, 1992. So I just dated myself there. But nitric oxide, honestly, the more I dig into nitric oxide, it is just an amazingly fascinating subject. It's almost like, what does nitric oxide not do in the body, right? It influences so many aspects of our physiology and biochemistry. Classically, let me, a little anecdotal story, if you will. When I was 17, I was scrubbing toilets at the gym. When I was 18, I was selling supplements at GNC and working on getting my personal training certification, right? So and I was really into bodybuilding at that point in my life. I had put down combat sports and really was actively competing in the sport of bodybuilding. So I was a little bit of a bro, and I'm not ashamed of that. There's a lot of good bro science that's actually pretty helpful. So in the sports performance world, in the fitness junkie world, we've embraced nitric oxide for decades. The narrative of nitric oxide supplementation is train harder, train longer, recover faster. And that is accurate. That is scientifically sound to say that, right? So we've been embracing it as a sports performance supplement for many, many years. And it's just now this year in 2024 really taking off as a clinical therapeutic in the functional medicine space, right? So nitric oxide is typically thought of as blood flow, vasodilation, and that's correct. That is one of the major functions, right? That is what won the Nobel Prize in 1998, was the discovery of nitric oxide as a signaling molecule within the cardiometabolic system. But it does so much more than that. First off, as far as vasodilation, your lymphatic vessels are also lined with an endothelial cell lining, right? So if we want to talk about lymphatic drainage and detox, guess what? Lymphatic vessel vasodilation is also regulated by nitric oxide. But it gets even better. Nitric oxide acts as a gasotransmitter. It regulates the release of other neurotransmitters. It actually influences how neural stem cells mature and get integrated into existing neural networks, and it regulates neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, right? It's deeply involved in the immune response, with immune cells expressing inducible nitric oxide synthase that will create thousands of times the magnitude of nitric oxide for the sake of using it as an antimicrobial to fight off foreign invaders, right? So there is a dark side to nitric oxide. There is such a thing as too much nitric oxide, but that's really only when we have inflammation and excess immune activation through the INOS pathway. So there's so many other functions that I would love to go into, but just for the sake of time, let's keep this moving along here. So I did include plenty of just educational slides, so that way you guys can kind of watch the recordings and check these out. Of course, I won't insult your intelligence by reading all of this, but just wanted to include some generous information, so that way you guys are empowered with that, of understanding exactly what nitric oxide is. Now, this slide I had a lot of fun making because I really wanted to make a statement, because we can strongly say that nitric oxide dysregulation is implicated in all chronic disease, right? So of course, heart disease, nitric oxide is the miracle molecule solution, for cardiovascular insults, cancer, there's conversation to be had there. Of course, COVID and long haul syndrome, cerebrovascular disease. What do you think is going on there? There's compromised blood flow to the brain. There's hypoxia and ischemia, and a hypoxic environment, believe it or not, doesn't do anything good for your mental health, right? Alzheimer's disease, there's a huge conversation to be had, diabetes, so on and so forth. So these are just a number of citations that start speaking to the role of nitric oxide in the top leading causes of death. So if you're not paying attention to nitric oxide and nitric oxide status in your clients and patients, I would really encourage you guys to get on it. So some of the low nitric oxide signs and symptoms. Now, it can be a lot of things. And because of the far-reaching effects of nitric oxide in the body, it could present in a lot of ways. But especially things like the chronic fatigue and sluggishness and brain fog or air hunger. That's a big one that terminology usually resonates with clients and patients. Cognitive issues, erectile dysfunction and sexual dysfunction. The list goes on and on, right? So this is actually my newest artwork. I love creating my graphics and everything that you're seeing on the screen here. So I just got this brand new graphic from my graphic designer last night because I really wanted to include it in the slide deck for today. So I'll just briefly walk through this here. With nitric oxide biosynthesis, most practitioners that are familiar with nitric oxide, they're familiar with the nitric oxide synthase pathway. This is our endogenous enzyme-driven and cofactor coenzyme-driven pathway where we take the amino acid L-arginine, and with the help of many cofactors, molecular oxygen has to be there in adequate concentrations. BH4, which is the cofactor that we were talking about a little bit ago, NADPH, FMN, FAD, magnesium, heme iron, glutathione. So there's a lot of cofactors needed here. Now, I made a little note that there are a number of nitric oxide synthase polymorphisms for all three isoforms, NOS1, 2, and 3, neuronal nitric oxide synthase, inducible nitric oxide synthase, and endothelial nitric oxide synthase. So somebody could have genetic predisposition to nitric oxide issues, but then of course, if they have what's called nitric oxide synthase uncoupling, which is essentially when the NOS enzyme, it becomes dysregulated. And instead of producing our miracle molecule nitric oxide, it starts producing superoxide radicals that then can contribute to more oxidative stress and more inflammation. I would argue that the majority of the American population has NOS uncoupling. And so this is where we wouldn't want to be using L-arginine-based nitric oxide supplements because it could actually be making the problem worse. Now, fortunately, in the past 15 years, research has elucidated this other pathway that has really gone overseen and underappreciated for way too long, which is this more primordial nitrate pathway, which is largely regulated by the oral microbiome, the acidic stomach environment, and your gastrointestinal microbiome. So nitrate, NO3, this is kind of like our storage form of nitric oxide. It's a much more stable molecule, and we can reduce nitrate into nitrite and then on into nitric oxide as needed, but only if we're supplying the body with enough dietary nitrate. So this is really largely coming from your dark green leafy things, your spinach, your bok choy, arugula, beets, which is why beets and beetroot powder has become such a popular supplement for increased blood flow, is because it supplies dietary nitrate. Now, there's conversation to be had about the nitrate concentration of produce can fluctuate depending on soil quality. Is it organic or not? What region of the United States was it grown? So nitrate concentration is not always adequate. And then, of course, think about people that might be eating carnivore or maybe a low oxalate diet. This is inherently a low nitrate diet. So I would really argue the majority of the population is nitrate deficient. And I would also argue that we should be thinking about dietary nitrate as an essential nutrient. It might be categorized as that eventually here. So that's about as much time as we have to spend on that particular graphic. We could certainly spend all day. A few other graphics looking at the roles of nitric oxide in some of these pathways here, but I want to keep this moving for the sake of time. So here's a slide that maps out some of the clinically relevant nitric oxide synthase polymorphisms. I think some of these are already on the MaxGen tests, and I've been working with my MaxGen friends to get some of these other ones added to it. So there will just be even more NOS SNPs that we can assess on the MaxGen testing. So I'm really grateful for their work with that. And here's a few slides talking about what we already discussed with nitric oxide synthase uncoupling, right? So this can be due to lack of cofactors or increased oxidative stress and inflammation. We get more NOS uncoupling as we age and undergo inflammaging, aka inflammation is creeping up as we age because of immunosenescence, which is our immune system and immune cells. It's getting old and it's getting worn out, so it's not able to keep oxidative stress and inflammation at bay. And there's a whole conversation to be had around anti-aging. The secret to anti-aging is to keep oxidative stress and inflammation down and calmed for as long as humanly possible to slow down the rate of immunosenescence and inflammaging, right? So we can restore functionality to the NOS enzymes by decreasing oxidative and inflammatory burden or any kind of infectious issue or metabolic illness issue, providing cofactors and nutrients and substrates like dietary nitrate, methylated B vitamins, so on and so forth. We're trying to decrease the burden that's being placed on these NOS enzymes. So this is where looking at the nitrate pathway a little bit more so, you can read through the slides to get a little bit more insight. But essentially, the nitrate pathway, it really starts with the oral microbiome. So when we ingest dietary nitrate, whether that's from a salad or a supplement, like I can't help myself, this Berkeley Life Nitric Oxide Foundation product. I'm shamelessly and very proudly the director of clinical education for Berkeley Life. So I just want to be transparent about that. But if you're supplementing with nitrate or consuming nitrate through the diet, some of that nitrate will be reduced to nitrite locally in the oral microbiome. Now, obviously, if you're swallowing a capsule, it's going to bypass the oral microbiome, drop down into the acidic stomach environment. Now, in the acidic stomach environment, some of that nitrate or nitrite can then further be reduced into nitrite or nitric oxide. And then the third step is the gastrointestinal microbiome, which can also facilitate the reduction of nitrate into nitrite and nitric oxide. Now, concomitantly, nitric oxide can also be oxidized back into nitrite or nitrate. So I like to really teach practitioners there's this sort of spectrum and flux that's going on with nitrate to nitrite to nitric oxide and up and down. And the body has a lot of very sophisticated mechanisms to regulate this. The goal being to have healthy, adequate nitric oxide signaling all day, every day, right? So this is where oral hygiene is starting to catch on a lot more in the functional medicine space, because we can improve athletic performance by optimizing the health of the oral microbiome. We can improve clinical outcomes by improving oral hygiene. And it's really by increasing the diversity and the nitrate reducing capacity of the oral microbiome. Dietary nitrate does have prebiotic-like effects, right? So we can use dietary nitrate to have its prebiotic effects to change the composition of the oral and gut microbiome while also boosting nitric oxide. So this is a good schematic here that breaks it down. And so that nitrate will largely get absorbed and circulated systemically, and our salivary glands actually store 10 times the amount of nitrate within the salivary gland as opposed to the plasma. So this is where using salivary nitrite test strips, such as these guys, can be a really helpful way to assess for nitric oxide bioavailability, because there's such a concentrated amount of nitrate in the salivary glands. And then as that saliva is interjected into the oral cavity, the nitrate in the saliva is interacting with the oral microbiome and being reduced to nitrite or even nitric oxide. So it's this really beautiful recycling mechanism that seems to be an evolutionary biology adaptation. So that way we can have nitric oxide availability whenever we need it. So here's a slide that breaks down some of the nitrate and nitrite reducing bacteria that inhabit the oral microbiome and the gut microbiome, right? So this is a very exciting area of research. And this draws attention to oral hygiene practices. You know, how many of your clients and patients are using chlorhexidine antiseptic mouthwash that might be killing their microbiome, smoking, vaping, just general poor hygiene, not flossing and brushing their teeth, too much mouth breathing, chronic inflammation. There's a lot of factors that can disturb the ecosystem, the garden of life within our oral cavity. And this has systemic and neuro implications, right? So certainly with the whole leaky gut conversation, we could talk about the leaky mouth conversation and how translocation of pathogen-associated molecular patterns within the oral cavity through a leaky mouth syndrome can drive a lot of neuro and systemic inflammation and oxidative stress. And then, of course, I trust everybody here is familiar with the concept of gastrointestinal leaky gut syndrome, which can be a major factor here. And nitric oxide has a very intricate relationship with the microbiome. The microbiome influences nitric oxide and all the different nitric oxide synthase isoforms, and vice versa, where nitric oxide as a sort of immunomodulatory redox molecule directly impacts the composition of the microbiome, right? So this is a great schematic breaking down the leaky brain progression from leaky gut, systemic inflammation to neuroinflammation and the leaky brain phenomenon. And then just another diagram that's more so highlighting the endotoxemia conversation, or sort of, preclinical sepsis, if you will, where we get all of that translocation of the lipopolysaccharide that then will stimulate the macrophages and the microglial cells, and also stimulate the expression of inducible nitric oxide synthase, as I was talking about before. This is a great diagram breaking down just the gut-brain axis in general. So most Americans are really suffering from this inflamed gut-brain axis that is characterized by heightened immune activation in this M1 polarization of the microglial cells and macrophages that we talked about. So it's this very pro-inflammatory phenotype. And our goal as practitioners is to shift away from this pro-inflammatory picture to this more anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective, metabolic protective phenotype over here. So this is where obviously repairing the gut lining, restoring the microbiome, supporting the body systemically. And I will be obviously mapping out what does this look like. So with that, I know I'm throwing a lot of information in a very short period of time. This will be, eventually turned into probably like a 30-hour course eventually. But let's look at, what does this look like in real life, in the trenches, when you're working with a client or patient that's really struggling with their health. So this is a good case study of one of my longest term clients that I've ever worked with. I have tons of data on this individual. We have a really, really good relationship and have been working together for, I think, like 2.5 or 3 years at this point. So struggling with a lot of chronic illness symptoms. She does have a history of medical trauma in her childhood and in teens. There is, some other neuropsychiatric predispositions that are things that we're working through. And she's doing all the things. She has a trauma therapist and a, medical doctor, and works with me and health coaching and all the things, right? And it's really a pleasure to serve her. But what I wanted to take a look at was, these are some of her mental map results plotted on a graph for a number of years now. So obviously you can kind of look through this. So I'll just briefly run through these specific markers. These are all, or the majority of these are core markers on the mental map test. And we also did the MaxGen genetic panel on her as well, which was really interesting to look at. So we've got C-reactive protein, neoterin, which is that biomarker that I was talking about earlier in the presentation, cryptopyrrole, myeloperoxidase, metalloproteinase 9, homocysteine, copper to zinc ratio, histamine, tissue transglutaminase IgG, leptin, calprotectin, and neurofilament light chain. So tracking these over the course of time. And obviously, the healing journey, there's going to be some ups and downs, and I could go into, the details of our 2+ year journey together. But even recently, as in yesterday, we got some, preliminary lab results, and really it's the best her biomarkers have ever looked, right? So at least from the physiological perspective, the psychological is a different conversation. But physiologically, we know objectively, using very well-studied clinical biomarkers, that we have improved her metabolic and physiological health, right? And especially with, it's hard to not go into the full story, we just don't have time. But especially with some of these mental health disorders, whether it's OCD or complex PTSD or ADHD or whatever it is, the psycho-emotional experience is not always in alignment or equivocal to the physiological status. But I think there's a lot of benefit and value from objectively tracking the physiology to be able to reflect to them, hey, actually things are looking pretty good under the hood. Physiologically, you're looking pretty good. So maybe we don't really need to get too worried or freaked out about this root cause or that root cause, right? Maybe instead of chasing root causes, we should just track your physiology. And maybe instead of hyper focusing on these biomarkers, which all look pretty good on paper, let's focus a little bit more on the mindset. Let's focus more on your outlook on life. Let's look at how we can dismantle self-limiting beliefs. Now, to me, I think navigating the psycho-emotional experience is a lot easier when we have our physiology working in our favor, right? I post on Instagram regularly about how you're probably not going to fully reap the benefits of psychotherapy if your brain is on fire. And that really resonates with people. How could you possibly effectively break down neural networks associated with self-limiting beliefs and construct new neural networks that are more in alignment with your higher self and where you want to go in life? How can you do that if you don't have neuroplasticity working in your favor and you have excess neuroinflammation? It is like physiologically, maybe not impossible, but you are fighting an uphill battle physiologically, which is why, hey, maybe I can't solve everybody's mental issues in a few consults. Maybe I can't help them find their sense of purpose. Maybe I can't, dismantle or undo all of the trauma that they've experienced in their life. But if I can at least help them optimize their physiology, if I can at least bring some objectivity, if I can bring some psycho-emotional relief by optimizing their biochemistry and physiology and epigenetics, now they can more clearly focus on the eudaimonic spiritual journey, right? So I hope you all can kind of appreciate that sentiment here. And certainly, I'm very proud of this table and graph that illustrates how much progress we've made. So some summary action and next steps as I am getting close to wrapping up here. So I would really say the majority of Americans have metabolic illness. They have methylation issues, nitric oxide dysregulation, and dysbiotic microbiomes, both in the oral cavity and the gut and the skin and and genitals and everywhere else that the microbiome exists, right? We have many microbiomes across our body and then the environment. And really all chronic disease is characterized by elevated oxidative stress and inflammation. And nitric oxide is really sort of the most powerful redox molecule that very much regulates inflammation and oxidative stress. So we really need to be testing and addressing and supporting nitric oxide signaling. Methylation-dependent reactions are crucial for a myriad of therapeutic pathways, including nitric oxide synthesis, right? So I have a post on Instagram. I've recycled it a couple times that says, "How about no MTHFR?" And it's a little play on words, not trying to offend anybody, but I'm talking about how individuals with MTHFR are genetically predisposed to having nitric oxide issues. So you mix like an MTHFR polymorphism with some NOS enzymes polymorphisms that can dramatically impair their health through dysregulated nitric oxide. So by restoring microbiome diversity, GI integrity, essential nutrient sufficiency, and nitric oxide status, and optimizing methylation, we can really efficaciously help our clients and patients heal. And this is why microbiome therapy, nutraceuticals, and nitric oxide support, to me, are really the foundations of healing programs, right? Now, of course, I think we all can appreciate holistic, healthy lifestyle foundations, the exercise and the sunlight and the stress management, nervous system regulation, all the good things. But if we're really just focusing protocol, clinical therapeutics, so on and so forth, these are just some of my favorite therapeutic supplements I like to start most people with. Obviously, I'm bio-individualizing it based on their specific lab results. I'm very much, employing a lot of good, healthy coaching psychology with regards to how many supplements do they want to take? How many can they really afford? Do they even like taking pills? And which ones are really most important based on their objective lab work, right? But these are just some of the things I like to employ, things like serum bovine immunoglobulins, prebiotics, probiotics, omega-3 fatty acids, methylated B vitamins, zinc, magnesium, dietary nitrate, carnitine, creatine, NAC, vitamin D3, K2. To me, these are just very foundational things. And certainly there's a lot of other great therapeutics that could be, added to that conversation. But I just would say that these are the supplements I'm most often recommending to optimize, the themes of this lecture. So I would really argue as practitioners, we need to be spending more time tracking physiology than chasing root causes. I think there's way too much, do this functional test, do that functional test, do this one, and it's chasing the root causes. But if we're not objectively tracking and assessing the physiology, we really don't know how those root cause things are actually impacting their health. For example, the amount of mycotoxin, which we can only measure like 20 mycotoxins in the urine out of like 1,000 mycotoxins that have been identified, right? The amount of mycotoxin in the urine doesn't tell us anything about their current state of physiology, right? So just to make that point, right? We need to be spending more time tracking physiology than chasing root causes. That's how we really drive successful clinical outcomes. So I really appreciate your time and attention. I really hope something resonated. I hope that some of this information is stuff that you can immediately employ and apply in your clinical practice starting tomorrow. You can, of course, get in touch at info@metabolicsolutionsLC.com. You can visit the website, follow my work on Instagram. And I just want to give a shameless plug. If you really enjoyed this content, I do have the FMHP certificate program that Bobby had mentioned. So this is my institute. I do train practitioners and providers through the FMHP certificate program. And I think the world needs a lot more FMHP practitioners. So if you like this content, you might be interested in that program, and we'd love to have you. So for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and wrap up for the day. But thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoyed the replay as well.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for all of that. That was some great information. I think everybody has a lot to go on from what you presented. I will collect any questions that may come through. If you guys have any others that you weren't able to get to us directly, you can email us at help@maxgenlabs.com, or you can also reach out to Brendan. We're going to schedule probably a live IG here pretty soon. He's got to travel again tomorrow, so he's going to be a little out of pocket for a few more days, but we will definitely catch up. But we loved having you here today, Brendan, so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'll look forward to doing a Q&A session and continuing my work with MaxGen. So thank you again.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining.